Hello, I'm Tim Richardson with the Church of Christ in Walker, Louisiana. I hope you'll be patient with me today. I'm not sure how well this is going to work. I have been sick with the COVID virus all week, as I indicated to you last Lord's Day morning, and I hope I don't wind up coughing too much. But there are a few things that I would like to be able to share with you. What I want to do is, first of all, let Jesus provide us a foundation principle to help us understand some things that we read about in the book of Daniel. In the 5th chapter of Hebrews, several years ago, I ran across something that had just never occurred to me before. It had been there all along. I'm certainly not learning anything that nobody else ever thought of before, but at the time it was new to me. And I want to read a few verses in Hebrews 5, starting with verse 7. It's talking about Jesus. In the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayer and supplication with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his piety. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through the things which he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation. The thing that occurred to me some time ago as I was looking at these verses is that it describes the challenge that Jesus faced in the Garden of Gethsemane. We know that as he was anticipating the cross, he knew how agonizing it was going to be. He knew how hard and painful it was going to be. And when he prayed 3 times, "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Jesus wasn't saying here, I've changed my mind. I'd really rather not have to go through with all of this. We know that Jesus said in John chapter 10 that the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He said, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself." And so I believe what Jesus was indicating in the Garden of Gethsemane is that while he was fully committed to doing what it took to provide forgiveness of sins, the hope of eternal life for the human race, that he was willing to do whatever it took in order to make that possible. But he was saying that if there's a less painful way to do this, it sure would be nice. And yet he was willing to accept the answer that God provided. Whatever it took in order to get the job done, that's what Jesus was willing to do. But the thing that struck me some time ago as I was looking at these verses is that Jesus offered up both prayer and supplication with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his piety. Now, the unusual aspect of this is that you know as well as I do that while Jesus was praying, "If it be possible, let this cup pass," we also know that the answer was no. There was no other way. Jesus giving himself as a sacrifice on our behalf, that was the only way that the hope of eternal life could possibly be provided for anybody. And the seeming contradiction here from a human perspective is that it tells us here that Jesus' prayer was heard because of his piety. And yet we know that the answer was no. And so there's an important lesson to be gained here. What I'm wanting to do right now is just help us to focus on a perspective on prayer, what we can expect from God, and how much confidence we have in him as we take our needs to him. Jesus knew that as he was struggling with the agonies of the cross that lay ahead of him, that he needed to put himself in the Father's hands, and he was doing that wholeheartedly, wanting God's will to be accomplished. But when Jesus provides this example for us, he's teaching us that if we really are committed to wanting God's will to be accomplished, not our own, when we are taking our needs to God, and sometimes we would like for things to be comfortable and easy and convenient, but if we really respect God and we really want his will to be done, it means that even if God says no, we believe our prayer has been answered in the best possible way. And I believe that's what these verses in Hebrews 5 refer to, that Jesus was heard even though he was asking for a less painful way to accomplish God's will. But there wasn't a less painful way. And he was willing to accept whatever needed to be done. And when he endured all the agonies of the cross, because that's the only way that things could be accomplished, then he believed that his prayer was being answered. Now, the reason I'm focusing on these verses, I'm starting here, is because if we go back to the Old Testament, I'm looking at the book of Daniel, where we have a Jewish man named Daniel and three of his Jewish friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are part of a conquered nation. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has conquered the people, and many of them have been taken captive and carted off from their home area and taken all the way to Babylon. They're there as prisoners, as captive people. And one of the things that kings at that time sometimes did, they'd kind of, in order to control people, they kind of mix up populations and send people from one place to another and make it less likely that they were able to raise an insurrection and protest. And it was just one way of keeping everybody under control. And what we find in Daniel chapter 1 is that Daniel and his friends, they as part of the educated, part of the people that the king thought might be able to offer some worthwhile knowledge and abilities to his kingdom, that he put them through a three-year training period. But one of the things that Daniel and his friends had to deal with is, we know that, of course, Nebuchadnezzar and those around him, they served idols. And I'm sure that whatever meat was offered quite often would have been sacrificed to idols. And of course, Daniel and his friends didn't want to have anything to do with that. And so, in order to avoid doing anything that they were not supposed to do as faithful Jews, and not violating any of God's standards, there were rich foods that were being provided to Daniel and his friends, and because they were trying to be so careful to make sure that they didn't violate any of God's instructions, that Daniel wound up saying to the supervisor, there's a lot of these things that we can't eat. Give us just vegetables and water. And the supervisor said, well, if I do that, the king's going to get upset with me. And you don't wind up looking as strong and healthy as the other people, and I'm going to get in trouble. And Daniel said, tell you what you do. You let us have vegetables and water for 10 days. And if we don't look healthier than anybody else at the end of that period of time, then you do whatever you want. And he was willing to go through with that experiment. And sure enough, at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better. They were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. And the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. And so you see here, people that even though they're a long way from home, even though they are prisoners, even though they're under difficult circumstances, they have a commitment to wanting to do the will of God. They recognize that no matter where they were, even when they were hundreds of miles away from home, they didn't they didn't avoid their responsibility to do those things that were pleasing to God and living up to his standards. And so we see in them a very, very important lesson, that whatever the circumstances, there is nothing more important for any of us than to live up to God's expectations and to let his values be our priority and determine under all circumstances to be the kind of people that he wants us to be. I want to notice just a few incidents in the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 2, you have Nebuchadnezzar, again as a pagan king, and he had a dream, and you're familiar with this dream. He dreamed about this big statue, but he was saying to his advisors, I want you to tell me what I dreamed and explain it. And they said, no, you tell us what you dreamed, and then we'll provide the explanation. But Nebuchadnezzar knew that if he just told them what he dreamt, they could make up any explanation they wanted to. And so Nebuchadnezzar said, I just want to make sure that you're not pulling the wool over my eyes. I don't want any trickery. You tell me what I dreamed, and then give me the explanation, and then I'll know that you've got some validity to what you're saying. And they were upset. The advisors were saying, no king ever asked anything like this before. And you just give us the dream itself and we'll explain it to you. And Nebuchadnezzar wound up getting mad and said, look, you're just a bunch of frauds. And I just want to get rid of the whole bunch of you. And Daniel heard about this. And so because the order was being given by the king, said, I just want to get rid of all these advisors. They're a bunch of fakes. I don't need them. And Daniel heard about this and sent a message. Said, give me a little bit of time. And in God's behalf, he offered to let God work through him in order to provide the explanation. And Daniel wound up explaining to the king. He said, no, I'm not telling you any of this because I'm smarter than anybody else. There is a God who reveals secrets. And he's the one who's trying to tell you what's going to happen. And so he described the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. A dream that involved a huge statue, and it had a head of gold. And it says, you, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a great single statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, in breast and its arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. And then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. And then Nebuchadnezzar was given the explanation. He was told that the statue represented 4 successive kingdoms. The first one was Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold. It was to be followed by a lesser kingdom of silver, a lesser kingdom of bronze, and then iron, and iron mixed with clay. And so there were going to be 4 successive kingdoms. And in the days of those 4th kingdoms, the days of the iron and the iron mixed with clay, a kingdom was going to be established, not brought about by human hands. It was going to break the other kingdoms. It was going to be replacing them, and there was a kingdom that was going to be filling the whole world, and it would never be destroyed. And we know that the explanations that are provided, that this referred to the coming of Jesus, the spiritual kingdom that he was established, and things happen exactly the way it was predicted in this way. Now, the reason that I mention this is simply because God is working through Daniel, even in a pagan environment, even talking to an idol-worshiping king like Nebuchadnezzar, to show that under all circumstances, God's ultimately in charge. God knows what's going to happen. God was indicating to Nebuchadnezzar what was going to take place. What was happening was that Nebuchadnezzar was the first kingdom, the kingdom of gold, and he was going to be replaced by the Medes and Persians, the silver kingdom. He was going to be replaced then by the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great. And then that would be replaced by the Roman Empire, which would be characterized by both the strength of iron and the brittleness of iron mixed with clay. And so God was indicating the things that were going to take place, and we know things happen exactly that way. And so we see here that God is trying to give people an insight into the things that he was planning to do. And we know that in the days of that fourth kingdom, the days of the Roman Empire, that's when the kingdom of the Lord really was established, and Jesus is ruling in his spiritual kingdom now. I want us to look just a little bit farther. I don't want to do this in order. I want to mention one more from chapter 6, because what I'm concerned about is just reminding us of how important it is that under all circumstances we trust God. We want more than anything else to do things his way. We want to commit ourselves to being the kind of people that he wants us to be. And he's going to be with us and help us when we're determined to be faithful to him. In Daniel chapter 6, We know that as time passed, Daniel was very influential in the government in Babylon for a long time. He was an advisor to several different rulers. But one of the things that he confronted was that there were those that, because he was a foreigner, there were people that were jealous that because he was a Jew and yet he was being given a lot of political power and influence, and there were those that didn't like it. And so there were some that tried to get him in trouble. And when Daniel was doing a good job, and there was no way that people could find anything justifiable to criticize him for, those that were trying to cause problems for him knew that the only thing that they could come up with was trying to find some criticism regard to his religious beliefs. And so there were men who talked the king into making a rule saying, for the next 30 days, you can't pray to anybody, any god, anybody except the king. And those that were making that rule, trying to make the king feel good and buttering him up a little bit, they knew that Daniel wasn't going to give in to that. And so that Daniel was in the habit of opening the window of his room and pointing himself toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he prayed to God. And even when the king had made this edict that you don't pray to anybody except me for this next month, he wasn't going to change anything for that. And so Daniel kept right on doing what he'd always done. And sure enough, there were those that watched and observed, and they knew what he was going to do. And so they got him in trouble. And the king was bound by the rule that he had made, couldn't avoid it, couldn't get out of it. There wasn't any way of changing it. And so the penalty was going to be that because Daniel had violated the instruction, that he was going to be thrown into a den of lions. And Daniel went into the den of lions, and God kept him safe. And the next morning, the king called out to Daniel and said, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to keep you safe? And Daniel said, yes. And we know that Daniel's faith was rewarded. We know that Daniel continued to pray to God. And what we see in Daniel and his friends was to determine that even when there was a great risk, even when they were literally putting their lives on the line, that they were willing to trust God and be whatever God wanted them to be under all circumstances. There's one more incident that I want to mention in this, and I'm backing up a little bit. This is when Nebuchadnezzar was still king. And Nebuchadnezzar, he evidently had some ego problems. And he had built a statue that he wanted people to bow down before him when they heard the music play. And he said that anybody that doesn't do this, doesn't honor my statue when they hear the music play, he's going to be thrown into a furnace of fire. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to do this. And that message was brought to Nebuchadnezzar. And the thing that is particularly significant, the thing that I'm really wanting to emphasize to us primarily today, is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had enough faith in God to know 2 things. Number one, they knew that God could deliver them if he chose to. There was no doubt in their mind that God could keep them alive if he felt like it was best to do so. But when these 3 friends were brought before Nebuchadnezzar, he said, I want to give you another chance. And when you hear the music, you bow down before them. And if you worship my statue, then everything will be okay. And they said, no, we don't have to have any time and we can tell you quite plainly. No matter what happens, we're not going to worship your statue. And Nebuchadnezzar got so angry that he told some guards, he said, you make this furnace 7 times hotter than it usually is. And it was so hot that as the 3 friends were thrown into the furnace fire, that the men who were responsible for putting them in there, they died. They couldn't stand the heat. And immediately after these 3 friends were thrown into the furnace, Nebuchadnezzar was observing from a distance, and he was saying to the people around him, he said, didn't we throw 3 people in there? And they said, yes. Well, how come I'm seeing 4? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were wandering around in the flames. They weren't being hurt at all. And when they were called out, then not only were they uninjured, they didn't even smell like smoke. But the really significant thing in all of this is that they told the king before they were thrown into the furnace, said, we believe that God is able to deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to worship your statue. And so they were very strongly committed to being what God wanted them to be. And they were willing to accept God's answer. They believed that God could rescue them. They actually believed that he would. But they had enough faith in God to say that even if God chooses not to, we're going to do what's right. We're going to run the risk of putting our lives on the line, and whatever God decides is okay. We're not going to dishonor him. We're not going to disobey him. We're not going to displease him in any way. Whatever he decides to do, his will be done, and we're willing to accept the consequences. It's just like when Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. He said, if it be possible, let this cup pass. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Jesus knew that God was able to save him from death. Jesus knew that he was putting his life in the best possible hands. But he also knew that his comfort and convenience was not the real objective. Accomplishing the will of God is what mattered. You remember when Jesus and his apostles were in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Judas came and soldiers were trying to take Jesus captive, that Peter pulled out the sword and was willing to start the war and fight for Jesus. And Jesus told Peter, said, put up your sword. But if we do that, it's going to ruin everything. How will those things be accomplished that need to be? Jesus was saying to Peter, now I can call down legions of angels. I've got defenses at my disposal. But God's will needs to be done. I came here to accomplish his will. And I'm not going to make things easy on myself. I'm not going to get myself out of this difficult situation. I'm here to accomplish the will of God. And like Jesus said, the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. That's what he came for. And he was willing to put his life on the line to make sure that what needed to be done for you and me was actually the priority, and that was going to be accomplished. As you and I pray, there are times that things don't always go the way we would like for them to go. There are times that we may wish things were easier and more comfortable, but it's important as we pray that we understand 2 things. Number one, that when we pray, we're talking to one who is able to do whatever needs to be done. But we need to have enough confidence in him to believe that even if he says no, because he sees more than we do, he looks at life from a broader perspective than we do. And even when God decides that under the circumstances that what would be most comfortable for us is not what needs to be done, that God is answering our prayer and doing what's best, even when he says no. We need to believe that we are in God's hands and really believe with all of our heart, with a willingness to accept God's judgment, to say, I want more than anything else for God's purposes to be accomplished, not mine. That's what Jesus' priority was. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's priority was. They knew God could save them, but even if he didn't, the most important thing was honoring God. And that's what matters for us as well. I appreciate you being here. May God bless you. Thank you.